Hey everybody, I'm Rick Beato.
Dave Onorato.
So Dave and I have been talking about players that play really loud and how we like to play loud. I always played loud in my bands. Dave played loud in his bands. And this was kind of what we grew up doing because amplifiers, to get any type of gain, typically you see back here, all these amps back here are really 50 or 100 watt amps. Yep. And to get them to distort, you had to crank them up. And part of that is learning how to control the sound. Let's talk about some of the players, Dave. You were talking about Yngwie, for example, when you worked with him.
I worked with him at Triclops, a studio here in town. We did this record called The Seventh Sign, and he came up from Florida and to do drums and guitar. And we had just a whole basically wall like this at the studio. And he came in, and I got to really see him basically sit there and play these amps at full volume, but play like he does and as cleanly as he does. And it's really something to see somebody of that caliber play like that on an amp that is that loud and can control it. And you don't hear mistakes. You don't hear the typical, slop notes or any kind of, it's just very, and obviously, Yngwie, some people don't like him, some people do. I could take him either way, but after doing that session with him, my respect for him went through the roof because watching him play it that cleanly and that loud.
And how loud, Dave?
We had like 2 or 3 full super leads flat out. Wide open.
Okay, so just
non-master, and all he used was his volume control. There was no booster, there was no nothing. We just ran them wide open. It was deafening.
So Dave said something interesting, used as volume control. So this is one of the things, when I play on, if you watch me play here on YouTube or on Instagram, I use my volume knob all the time. And I almost never turn my volume up all the way unless I'm really going for a loud, unless I want a lot of gain on a certain line or something like that. But I love the tone of my guitar when it's at 5 or it's at 2. And I like having that, the ability to have the amp loud, but then control the amount of gain by just using the volume control and the output, because it makes your playing way more dynamic.
Yep.
When all the notes are too even and you're using compression like that, if your amp is really distorted, distortion equals compression. And Dave will always say, oh, that's too compressed of a sound. If he's trying an amp out and it has too much gain, that's his first thing he'll say, oh, it's too compressed.
Well, and it just, because it gets boxy, it tends to start to be very cubical sounding to me, and it limits certain frequencies out, and you just get this one particular parameter of the amp, whereas if you back the gain out a little bit and then bring the guitar up, it sort of like makes notes sort of bloom, and it kind of gives it this air to it.
That's interesting too, because in the studio I would always use compression, not just to control the transients of notes, but to control the tone, to affect the tone of an instrument, because compression can really change the sound. As Dave's saying, sometimes you want it to sound boxy. You want an instrument, and you'll compress it a certain way, or you'll put an EQ before or after a compressor in this control room, this after the sound's being recorded. And I'll shape a sound using compression, and now you can shape sound using multi-band compression and stuff like that. But with guitar, being able to control loud guitar amps is an art. Talk about Eddie Van Halen, for example.
Well, Ed was really the first guy that, as a kid, when Van Halen 1 came out, I was 8 years old, and you never, to that point, you heard distortion on guitar a certain way, and then there was a few guys that were like Boston, like Tom Schultz had.
Brian May had a lot of gain.
And I was going to say Brian May had a really distinctive thing, but Eddie, what I noticed right off the bat with Eddie was that it was recorded loud. You heard, you really got me those first couple of things. It's you could tell how loud that amp is, and even with the reverb that they added, which was a great EMT plate, but it was just loud, and Angus was another one that you heard. It was like, man, they are just pegging those amps to the board, and the compression in the board is even adding to it. But he played, if you watched Van Halen, he used his volume control constantly, and he was never always all the way up. A lot of times, he would like back off, and he would, there was a lot of dynamics. Especially
the whole first record.
Yeah, well,
he's just controlling the volume on that.
Right,
If you think about, pick any song.
Yeah, any of them.
In the verses, he brings his gain back.
Yeah, he backs off a little bit when he's doing a lot of arpeggiated chords.
Yes.
And trying to get a lot of definition.
Yep.
Because he did have,
And then when you do a fill line, he just brings it up and then brings it back down again.
Right.
But then you hear him swell into the choruses. That was a big thing. And that's really what pretty much all those great players you would hear do. They'd swell their guitar into the chorus.
Yeah, and it's a whole different technique of playing an amplifier. It's like the amp is making you play a certain way. You're not dictating what the amp is doing. It's dictating what how you're going to control it, and it affects your playing. And what I notice with a lot of younger players is that they're not playing on an amp that's loud, so their dynamics tend to be very straight across. And it's sort of like, and it's not that they're not good players, it's just that the actual what their interface with their amplifier or what they're playing through is just very straight, so dynamics get lost. A lot of the sort of the airiness of
a lot of them have put compression before just really distorted guitar parts and guitar sounds or guitar simulations. And a really heavily distorted guitar, if you're using a JCM 800 model or using an EVH model or a PV 5150 or a Mesa model, those things are, when they're that distorted, they're compressed already. You can't get any more compressed.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
And if you want to, and one of the things about having good tone, I would always have bands in the studio. I'd get them to play their parts, and I worked with a lot of new metal bands, and they would play with so much gain. Every amp that came in here was a high gain amp. So I would have them play, and I'd say, we get a lot better tone if you just back off the gain on the amp.
Yeah.
And it would be really uncomfortable for them to play. I would back it off to where it sounded good to me, and if they needed it for a pinch harmonic or something, I would sit there during the performance and I would just play with a preamp. Now.
Add it as
I go, like as a performance or something, or punch it in. But then they would realize, oh my God, that sounds so much better because it actually has dynamics to it.
Right. And it's not that it was the player's fault. It just was those were the amps. That's how they're voiced. And so a lot of new amps are voiced with scooped mids, and unfortunately, scooped mids is great to a point, but if you go too far with it, you just don't have any dynamics at all.
Right.
You have to have some kind of mid range in there. So like he was saying, you would take maybe a heavier distorted amp on one side, take a cleaner amp, mix them both to get everything in the bandwidth. And unfortunately, but like now we have like Kempers and all these modulators.
XFX. Helixes, quad cortexes.
Yep. And those machines.
Most of the people that use those that I know that are my friends, they use really heavily distorted sounds, or they'll use really clean, ultra clean sounds with a ton of compression. And you'll notice a lot of guitarists use the wraps on the fingerboard or around the neck to dampen the strings, which is really what we're talking about here. If you heard Eric Johnson play, how loud was Eric Johnson back in the 80s, Dave?
I saw him twice. I saw him in 85, 86, and he was deafening.
What about Stevie Ray Vaughan?
Stevie Ray Vaughan, I saw him in 85. He was, it was, wide open. You couldn't get any louder. And I like loud. There's loud, and then there's painfully loud. And Stevie was painfully loud when he would go to his clean tones, and
It's like rip your head off.
Yeah, man. It was glorious. It was Stevie Ray Vaughan. I guess I'm going to go deaf. Go deaf by him. That's fine. But it really was overkill.
Do you think that in-ears actually affects people's playing too?
Greatly.
Yeah.
Greatly. In fact, I just saw a band recently. There was a band, Styx, that they all use in-ear. Everybody uses in-ear. That's the norm now. You have to. And I could tell from those guys, and Night Ranger played with them too, those bands played completely differently than the times I'd seen them before in the early days. And not that they were bad or it was worse or whatever. It was, I can see from a sound man's perspective, it's really easy just to be like out front, everything's controlled. But there was none of this like guitar just pushing you like, yeah, okay, that's really...
Well, what's interesting too, one of the downsides of getting old with guitar players, and I didn't play a lot of gigs. I haven't played a lot of gigs because I've been producing for the last 25 years or so. So I've luckily saved my hearing more than people that have been out playing, right?
Unlike me.
And you'll find a lot of older guitar players that they have a lot higher gain now in their tones, because their hearing is going, and you need a more complex waveform in order to hear it better.
Yeah, the treble is way louder than it should have been, and the gain is a lot more.
Yeah, so a lot of the players that would play with a lot less gain, as they've gotten older, their amps get gainier because to them it sounds like it used to.
Well, perfect example, and I'll probably get a bunch of crap for this, but to me, that's what happened with Van Halen in the 90s. You listen to his amplifiers going from the first 5150, which had tons of gain. I mean,
my first Fender version sounds amazing, and at each successive one, that was 2006.
Well, yeah, and so what I'm saying is
they would get more gain.
They would get even more gain.
That's right.
And it got to a point where it was like on the Model 3, I've never even used the lead channel, and it's so gained out.
Yeah,
it's almost unusable.
Right, the second channel is like the lead channel used to be.
Right, and I kept going. I kept saying to myself, and I went to a few NAMM shows, and I saw Van Halen at the NAMM shows and stuff, and it got to the point where we, as collective of some good friends of mine who are really good players, I won't name them, but we all kind of said, I think he's losing his hearing because he can't hear high end anymore because these amps are so buzzy in the high end. He would take the presence control and just, way up. And we're just like, man, what, and we just laughed because we're sitting there going, he probably can't hear it. And so the gain got much more buzzy, and so did the presence control. And so, and I'm not, look, man, I love gain as much as everybody else. So, but I'm just saying,
we love gain.
Yeah, believe me.
Look at all the amps I have. Look at the green screen back here.
Put it this way, one of my favorite amplifiers is a Mesa Mark III. So you can't. It has.
Now, Dave, you can also have. Dynamics is like a big part. We were listening to Al Di Meola a little earlier. Yeah. Al playing recently from 2 weeks ago, playing his nylon string, and Al plays so dynamically and so rhythmically that his right hand is that's where all the groove comes from. Same when Tommy Emmanuel, when I interviewed Tommy took this Gibson off the wall. He knew that the strings were too. He plays it as like strings are too light. He goes, "I'm tuning it." He says it in the video. I'm going to tune it a little bit sharp, and he did. He didn't even have a reference tone. He tuned it sharp because he wanted the string tension to be right because we didn't have someone there to set it up. Yeah, and he needed that resistance to be right.
And you could tell when he tuned it up, he played like he would normally play. You could tell it was a difference. He was like, no, I got to do this, and he did it, and he was like, oh, okay, yeah.
But the dynamics, the whole rhythmic feel, dynamics with acoustic guitar playing, or if it's Pat Metheny, my interview with him when I was sitting this close to Pat, Pat said, I never play two notes back to back the same volume, and he doesn't.
He doesn't. Yeah.
He doesn't. His right hand is constantly changing volumes of notes.
Yeah.
If you listen to his Travels record, for example, some of the ballads on there that he plays, some of the notes are so quiet that you have to really strain to hear them. He and it's beautiful. That's what I love about Pat's playing is that, beyond the incredible melodic ideas and development of ideas, his dynamics are so just amazing, and it makes the songs exciting when you hear somebody swell into a chorus of a song or something, or
the dynamics can make or break a song. Really. And some of the most famous guitar parts are simple swells or simple things. It's not it's not this huge attack, but knowing how to use those dynamics and then having an amplifier to shoot that back at you too. it is a really kind of a lost art a little bit.
Well, I noticed it on the Queen, on the multi-tracks that how Brian's tone, when he backs off the volume.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got the phase switches on his guitar too. Mm-hmm. The multiple phase switches. He uses all three pickups. He has such a variety of tones. And then you put the volume control with it. Yeah. It's like you got 4 guitars there without even having to play through anything.
Yeah. And I was, at one time I had seen Tides of War, King's X. I went to a sound check, and he was basically standing right here, and he had his old Strat Elite, and same thing there. You know, he would move the volume knob like just barely, and the completely different amp sound just by the volume control. I mean, his guitar was active, so it had a lot of different tones in it, right? Just with the volume control. But I could tell his playing would change dynamically, just drastically, just by that volume control. He would play it a certain way, and I even mentioned to him, I said that kind of gets lost in some of the records. He kind of was like, yeah, I'm working on that, you know. So, but it's really interesting. The player, how an amplifier can really make a certain player play a certain way. Especially, like you said, Brian May is a perfect example. I mean, those AC30s are wide open, and they have a certain tone to them, and he's.
Dave, talk about how loud an AC30 is, so that people. I know people don't get a chance to play through these things. I mean, I'm lucky. I've got an AC30, and I have a couple Marshall Plexis, and I've got these things are loud.
Yeah, an AC30.
Oh my God!
It's definitely a very loud amp and a very directional amp. So it has that tendency to really split your head open if it's wide open and you're standing directly in line with it. It can be painful.
So we were also talking about the Beatles documentary and how they were using the '68 Fender Twins, a pair of them. Mm-hmm. And how loud they had 2 U67s, Neumann U67s on them, but how loud. Twins are unbelievably loud.
Yeah, they're extremely loud.
And they were probably pretty loud in the room.
Yeah, they seem. I mean, I don't think they were. You know, they weren't like wide open, but I would say they put those amps probably halfway up.
Yeah.
And they played a certain way. You looked away like how John was playing, and even how
you can tell that John controls the dynamics with his right hand. Watch John Lennon's right hand.
He has to with that Casino guitar. It's completely hollow.
That's right.
So if he lets go of it, it's just going to howl.
Yes.
So he had to play that guitar a certain way with that amp a certain way, and you can tell by the way he's playing. And like I said,
watch both of his hands. His left hand, the way he's muting things, and he's really controlling the tone. A lot of people don't realize how good the Beatles were as players.
Yeah.
I mean, just pro players. McCartney would mute all the strings when he's playing his bass.
And that's a big thing with all of these amps that are loud.
Yes.
Your muting technique is almost as important as your picking technique.
That's right.
Because your deadening notes that would get away from you or any kind of sour notes that you might hear, it's a whole nother way of playing. And if you don't have a loud amplifier, you can use a compressor, you could use all this stuff to deaden that, but
or you can wrap something around the strings,
right,
so nothing rings open,
right. So
But really, when we're playing, I'm muting with my thumb. I'm muting with these fingers. I'm muting with my right hand. If I'm playing a note, I might just go through every string and play one note on the B string. And if you were to go and hit the strings, every single string is dead
right.
Except for that one string. And when Dave's doing the same thing,
I use the same kind of, my thumb over the thing, sort of like Jimmy did, and that was just instinctive because I had to keep those notes dead because
This is from playing loud.
Yeah,
this is why we learned that technique, because otherwise it was just slop.
I mean, I remember distinctly. I was doing a session. I had a Sun Model T and a Sun Model T and a High Watt 100. And they were up, okay. I mean, I was doing like the Leslie West; it was nailed. And I had a junior at the time, one P90, one volume knob, and if you let that thing go, it was like a stuck pig. It would just squeal and just go. And I remember having to turn a certain way in the studio and play at a certain angle to get rid of the RF noise and to find the sweet spot where it would deaden out right. And it was a whole thing. It was like, okay, not only do I got to play this part, I got to get clean, I got to do a solo, but I got to stand a certain way just to get it. And then when I heard the playback of it, it was cool because I remember one of the engineers was like, man, that was so loud. He goes, I seriously thought we were gonna like pop something in the mic or something. And he said, but man, there seriously is nothing like hearing that air moving on a track. You know, we would just isolate it, and literally the guitar would, like, before I'd hit the note, it would kind of go woo, and then you'd hit the note. You know? And it had this thing to it that was percussive, and that was what was so glorious about it. And if you isolate a lot of 70s tracks of guitar players, that's there. You can't get around it. So it's this percussive sort of wallop. He used to call it the wallop. You know, it's like wah, and then you get.
You can tell even when I was just did my video on Ride Like the Wind with Christopher Cross's guitar solo. When you solo it, you know that that's a cranked amp. You can tell that you can tell what a loud amp sounds like. It has that wallop.
Yeah, and most of the 70s, 80s rock stuff. That's what, you know, that was part of it. You know, and of course, obviously, you still get it today, but when you have the volume with it, it's just a whole other thing, and you have to control it. You can't just let it go, you know. So there was a whole nother aspect of playing a loud amplifier that is sort of lost, unfortunately, on a lot of new amps because it's so controlled and so compressed that people play sort of a different way now, you know. I mean, there's still guys like Phil X and you know, modern guys that are cranking.
Well, Phil, I always think of Phil and Dave are very similar. In that the way that they attack the guitar, and they know how to just control the sound and milk every nuance out of the sound, no matter how loud it is. Either they can just it's always in control. It's always on the verge of being out of control.
Well, then that's the thing. It's like you know, for me, like Angus was the perfect guy for that because he always sounded like he was getting fall off the rails at any second, but he was in total control. Like he played it to the T, man. And if you watch Angus live in the 70s, he would just his volume control. That's all he did. He had volume, and he would. And as we were saying before, you know, a lot of those tones, when you go back and really listen to them, they're not as distorted as you think.
That's right.
It's more volume.
And almost never. If you think of when you think of Jimmy Page, and you go and listen, you really listen to it. It's like that's hardly distorted at all.
Right. Yeah. Jimmy Page, Angus, all those guys, even Van Halen, on the scale of you know, distortion now, they're relatively,
oh my God,
they're clean. They're really not that distorted. I mean, so those guys really played those amps right, and there is something to be said about. You know, a player who was astute enough to be like, okay, he knows he's a good player, but he also finds his tone, and he plays that amp. You know, I mean, like, you know, I hate to keep going back to it, but Brian May, I mean, his rig is so oddball and so strange, but it's so him, and you couldn't hear him play anything else, you know, and that's why I suspect he's never played anything else.
That's right.
Because he found it. He's like, I found my sound, and that's how he plays, you know. So, like any good player, you know. I mean, Brian could probably play anything, and it's going to sound like Brian May. But, you know, those tones and the way he plays, he has to have his rig a certain way, and I wouldn't want to hear it any other way.
Well, this is why I'm a big proponent of people finding their own sound with real gear, because I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
Is, you know, when I think of any of these great players that I grew up, you know, as my heroes, they all had their own unique rigs.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, of the list of all the guitar players that I would list as heroes of mine or people who really influenced me, all of them had their own thing. And even if they played similar rigs, I mean, perfect example is like, I'm a huge Ritchie Blackmore fan. You know, and Yngwie has the same rig.
But they sound nothing
But they sound completely different.
Right.
I mean, you know, and so David Gilmour, same thing. You know, I mean, all these guys, Billy Gibbons, I mean, you know, Robin Trower, just the list goes on and on. I mean, you know, even like guys like Johnny Winter or Albert Collins, Albert King, they all had their own thing, and they all found a certain amplifier, a certain guitar that sounded a certain way, and then they played upon that. I mean, perfect example, you know, Stevie Ray Vaughan, he's using a Strat, used a plethora of different amps, but Stevie always sounded like Stevie no matter what he played.
That's true.
And but he had his thing, you know. I mean, you can't. It's that indefinable thing, and it's that personal stamp. So anytime all the great players that I listen to, I can hear a couple notes. You know how it is. You hear,
Right.
and you're like, that's that guy, you know. And it's like, and to me, that's just as important as what you play, you know. The voice. It's hard to find a voice now. To me, I almost think like we have so many options. We have too many options.
That's right.
And so you get caught in this thing of like, you know, I've got my Kemper and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to dial this up for 8 hours and try to find some. Whereas,
or you have your Helix and you have 50 different presets that you're playing for your
Right.
gig, or you've got your Axe effects or your Quad Cortex, and
which all you're trying to do is make that simulator sound like something real.
right.
Anyway, so it's almost like I try to tell players, you know, go out and play amps, real amps, and play them and try to play them so you have a good reference when you go onto a simulator or a modeling amp, that you know what you're trying to go for.
That's
almost.
right.
Like you have a go point of like, okay, I love the way that, you know, that high watt sounds or that Vox. And I've really heard that amp and studied it and figured it out and played on it, and then go back and try to, you know, modulate or modify something in a simulator, you know.
I mean, it's difficult if you can't really go into a music store and turn an amp way up and play. I mean, it's very hard.
Can. You totally
Well,
can.
you can. I don't do it, but Dave.
I highly recommend it.
Dave will do it. But I don't go to music stores anymore.
Well, maybe not as much as I used to, but yeah. But I still, hey man, that's what they're there for. I mean, you know, it's like if you can't buy, you know, if you're going in to buy a guitar.
Dave used to work at every different music store that I went to, but we would go when you worked at Midtown Music, for example.
Yeah.
I would go in and play.
Yeah,
I go in and play all the time.
Yeah, you came in. I remember that you came in and you played the high watts because we had the high watt stuff, and you were like, "Oh, I'm thinking about buying one of these." I was like, well, "You need this."
I play the oranges. I play the Marshalls. I bought like 10 JCM 800s.
Yeah, I just put them in the back room. I'm like, dude, turn up as loud as you want, man. I mean, you know, and he would, and it was like, to me, that was like, yeah, that was half the reason to go to a music store was, you know, it's like I don't want something in a box. I want to crank it up before.
So one of these days, I'm going to have people come to the studio. I'm going to invite a few
Yes.
people that are watching the channel and come and play some of these amps, turn them up, see what they sound like, see how they react with your guitar, and
move some air.
and move some air.
Yeah.
So leave your comments in the comments section. I'd love to know what you think about our discussion. Don't forget to subscribe here, and follow Dave on Instagram.
Dojo Guitar Repair.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks.
That's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment. Check out my new Quick Lessons Pro guitar course that just came out. Also, the Beato book, if you want to learn about music theory, that's how you do it. And check out my Beato ear training course at beatoeartraining.com. And don't forget, if you want to support the channel even more, think about becoming a member of the Beato Club. Thanks so much for watching.